You're at 18,000 feet, and the sky is full of things trying to kill you, which would be terrifying if you had time to be terrified. Except you don't, because the Messerschmitt on your tail has just opened fire, and the only thing standing between you and the channel below is the next 4 seconds of your own reflexes. You roll. The tracers pass exactly where you were. This is your third sortie today. It is not yet noon. Somewhere below, England is having breakfast, going to work, listening to the radio, completely unaware that boys like you are deciding, 4 seconds at a time, whether any of that continues. This is your story. It's 1115 on the 18th of August, 1940, and you've already flown 2 sorties since dawn, which means your hands have the specific tremor that comes from adrenaline metabolizing faster than your body can process it, a tremor you've learned to fly through, because grounding yourself for shaking hands is not an option available to a Spitfire pilot in the 3rd week of what the newspapers haven't yet started calling the Battle of Britain, which you and everyone at RAF Biggin Hill already understand is exactly that. Your name is Thomas Ashworth. Everyone calls you Tommy. You are 20 years old. You are from Kent, which means you can sometimes see your own county from altitude, the specific landscape of home turned into a tactical map, hedgerows and church spires becoming reference points for navigation rather than the geography of your childhood. You joined 609 Squadron in June. You have been operational for 8 weeks. The average lifespan of a new pilot in your position, which an instructor told you with the specific brutal honesty that flying training has no room not to have, is approximately 4 weeks. You have already outlived the average by double. The Messerschmitt on your tail is flown by someone you will never know anything about except his aircraft's silhouette and his evident skill, which is considerable. He has anticipated your role and adjusted, which means this is not his first engagement either, which means the next several seconds are going to require everything your 8 weeks of combat flying have taught you, and possibly things they haven't. You roll again, harder this time, the horizon spinning through your canopy in a way that would be disorienting if you allowed it to be, and you feel your Spitfire respond with the specific quickness that makes it, whatever its other limitations, genuinely capable of outturning the Messerschmitt 109 at this altitude, which is the single tactical fact that has kept you alive through 8 weeks of engagements where almost everything else favored the German aircraft. You come out of the roll behind him. This is the moment that determines everything you have, perhaps 2 seconds before he recovers his own positioning, 2 seconds in which your guns either find him or don't, 2 seconds that will either end his war or continue yours, and there is no version of training that fully prepares a 20-year-old for the specific psychological weight of those 2 seconds. The knowledge that you are about to try to kill a man you have never spoken to and will never know anything else about. You fire. The Messerschmitt's wing root erupts in a brief orange bloom, and the aircraft begins the specific, uncontrolled tumble that means a hit, not a kill necessarily, but a hit. And you watch for the half-second that discipline allows before you have to look away, scanning for the next threat. Because the sky at 18,000 feet during the Battle of Britain does not pause to let you process what you've just done. You don't know if he survived. You will never know if he survived. This is one of the specific cruelties of fighter combat that no one mentions in the recruitment posters, the not knowing, the absence of resolution, just an aircraft that stopped flying normally and a war that continued regardless. Your fuel gauge shows you have 11 minutes before you need to be on the ground. You turn for home. You grew up close enough to Biggin Hill that the sound of aircraft was simply the sound of your childhood, an ordinary background noise that other children elsewhere associated with their own ordinary backgrounds, trains, perhaps, or factory whistles, or church bells. But for you, it was always engines, the specific drone of RAF training flights passing overhead on their circuits, a sound so constant that you didn't consciously register it until you left home for the first time and noticed, with genuine surprise, how quiet the rest of England was by comparison. Your father managed a small engineering works that made precision components for agricultural machinery, a business that demanded exactness without glamour. And he approached his work and his family with the same unhurried competence, a man who believed that most problems, mechanical or otherwise, could be solved by paying closer attention than the problem expected you to pay. Your mother ran the house and, more specifically, ran you and your younger sister with the particular firm warmth of someone who had decided, early in her marriage, that love and discipline were not opposing forces, but the same force applied with different emphasis, depending on the situation. You were obsessed with aircraft from an age too young to properly remember, which your mother attributed to growing up under the flight paths, and which you privately believed was something closer to destiny, though you were careful never to say this aloud, because your father had specific opinions about the difference between enthusiasm and self-importance. You built models from kits bought with saved pocket money, dozens of them eventually, suspended from your bedroom ceiling on threads in formations you adjusted constantly based on photographs in aviation magazines. Each model, a small act of devotion to something you didn't yet understand, you would eventually be asked to risk your life for. At 12, you talked your way into a tour of the Biggin Hill Aerodrome through a family friend who worked in administration there, and you spent the entire visit in a state of attention so complete that you remember details from that afternoon with a clarity that exceeds your memory of most subsequent years. The specific smell of aviation fuel, the sound a Bristol Bulldog's engine made on startup, the particular quality of a pilot's offhand confidence as he answered your too many questions with genuine patience rather than the dismissal you'd half expected. You joined the Air Training Corps at 16, the same year your father took you aside and asked, carefully, whether you understood that the aircraft you loved were, increasingly, instruments built for a purpose you might eventually be asked to fulfill. You said you understood. You did not. Not fully. Not in the way you would come to understand it. But the conversation mattered anyway. It was your father's way of ensuring that your enthusiasm had at least encountered the shape of its consequences before those consequences arrived. Your flying training began in early 1939, accelerated by a program that was, in retrospect, training pilots for a war the government hadn't yet officially acknowledged was coming. You took to flying with an ease that surprised your instructors and didn't surprise you at all, the specific spatial intuition that the models suspended from your ceiling had apparently been quietly building for a decade, made, suddenly, vertiginously real. You went solo in March 1939. You remember the specific silence of the cockpit, with no instructor's voice in it, the aircraft entirely your responsibility for the first time, and the particular fear that arrived not from danger, but from competence, the realization that you could actually do this, that the thing you'd wanted since before you could properly want anything was now, simply, a fact about your life. War was declared 6 months later. You did not yet know how quickly the distance between training and consequence was about to close. Operational Training Unit, was where the romance of flying and the actual mathematics of combat aviation finally met each other properly, and the meeting was not gentle. You arrived at the OTU in May 1940, having logged perhaps 60 hours of total flying time, almost none of it in anything resembling a fighter aircraft, and you were given approximately 2 weeks to become competent in the Spitfire before being declared operational and posted to a squadron, a timeline that would have seemed insane in any previous era of aviation history, and that made a kind of brutal sense given what was happening across the Channel, where France was collapsing with a speed that rewrote everyone's assumptions about how long preparation could reasonably take. The Spitfire was unlike anything you'd flown before, and falling in love with it took approximately 1 flight. The aircraft had a specific quality that pilots struggled to describe to non-pilots, a responsiveness that felt less like operating a machine and more like an extension of your own intentions. The control column requiring barely more than thought to translate into movement. Your instructor, a weathered veteran of 26, who had already seen combat over France during the brief, catastrophic campaign there, told you that the aircraft would teach you things your hands needed to know faster than your conscious mind could process them, and that the pilots who survived were the ones who let this happen rather than fighting it. You crashed once during training, a hard landing that damaged the undercarriage but not you, an error born from overconfidence rather than insufficient skill, and your instructor's response was not anger, but a specific quiet disappointment that affected you more than anger, would have the sense that you had let down not just yourself, but the aircraft itself, an irrational feeling that you nonetheless carried forward into every subsequent flight. You were posted to 609 Squadron at RAF Middle Wallop in June 1940, arriving in the specific atmosphere of an operational fighter squadron during what everyone understood, without anyone officially declaring it, was the opening phase of a battle for Britain's survival. The squadron's existing pilots, men with weeks or sometimes only days more experience than you, since the attrition had already begun consuming the pre-war regulars, absorbed new arrivals with a practiced efficiency that had more to do with operational necessity than warmth, though warmth arrived too, eventually. Once you'd proven yourself capable of staying alive long enough to be worth knowing. Your first operational sortie was a patrol over the Channel that produced no contact with the enemy, which felt anticlimactic in a way you didn't expect, and that the more experienced pilots found mildly amusing. They remembered their own first patrols, the specific deflation of preparing yourself completely for combat and receiving instead an hour of empty sky and growing fuel anxiety. Your first actual engagement came 11 days later, a confused, chaotic encounter with a formation of Messerschmitt 110s escorting bombers toward an airfield, and you fired your guns at an enemy aircraft for the first time, with hands that were, you noted with some surprise, considerably steadier than you'd expected. The training having apparently built something in you that the actual moment simply activated rather than created from nothing. You did not score a confirmed kill in that engagement. You also did not die, which your squadron leader noted, with the specific, dry understatement that characterized RAF humor under pressure as a satisfactory outcome, all things considered. By August, you had 3 confirmed kills and a reputation within the squadron as someone who could be relied upon to hold formation discipline, even when every instinct argued for the kind of individual heroics that got pilots killed. You had also developed the specific exhaustion that accumulated not from any single flight, but from the compound weight of weeks during which death was a colleague rather than an abstraction, present at breakfast and absent by dinner with a regularity that the squadron had learned not to discuss directly, because discussing it directly served no operational purpose and considerable psychological cost. The 18th of August arrived like every other day had arrived for 6 weeks, with a dawn briefing, an aircraft you trusted with your life, and the specific knowledge that today's mathematics of survival were entirely unknown until you were already living inside them. Your third sortie of the 18th launches at 1,340, which means you have been awake since 0430, airborne for roughly 2 of the intervening 9 hours, and running on the specific fuel of T, adrenaline, and the particular discipline that develops when collapse is simply not an option your body is permitted to exercise. The squadron scrambles to intercept a large formation, reported crossing the coast near Dover, bombers with heavy fighter escort, the kind of raid that the controllers' voices over the radio have learned to flag with a specific tension that doesn't require additional words to communicate urgency. You climb hard, the Spitfire performing the way it always performs, which is to say better than you have any right to expect from a machine, and you reach altitude with 11 other aircraft from 609 Squadron in a formation that looks, from below, like discipline, and looks, from inside it, like 11 young men trying very hard not to think about the mathematics of what's coming. Peter Hadley is on your left wing. Peter joined the squadron 2 weeks after you, a quiet grammar school boy from Surrey, with an easy laugh and a habit of humming while he checked his instruments before takeoff. A habit you'd noticed and never mentioned, because mentioning it would have made it self-conscious, and you'd both, without discussing it, decided that the small rituals that got a man through a sortie were not subjects for commentary. Peter has 4 confirmed kills. Peter is, by any reasonable measure, good at this. The German formation arrives at altitude precisely where the controllers predicted, which feels less like reassurance and more like confirmation that the next several minutes are going to unfold exactly as badly as everyone has prepared for. Messerschmitt 109s peel off from the bomber escort in a maneuver you've seen enough times now to recognize before it fully develops, and the formation breaks apart in the specific controlled chaos of a fighter engagement beginning, 11 aircraft becoming 11 individual battles within the space of 4 seconds. You take a 109 onto your tail almost immediately and spend 90 seconds in the kind of violent, disorienting maneuvering that leaves no capacity for anything except the immediate physical problem of staying alive, your body operating on training rather than thought, the specific narrowed focus that combat produces and that you've come to recognize as something close to peace, strange as that sounds, because there is no room inside it for anything except the present 4 seconds. You lose the 109 inches cloud. You climb back toward the formation, scanning, and you see Peter's aircraft a half-mile away, trailing smoke from the engine in the specific dark gray that means damage rather than destruction. Still flying, still apparently controllable, heading generally toward the coast and home. You move to cover him. This is automatic, unconsidered, the specific reflex of formation discipline combined with something else that doesn't have a tactical name. The second 109 comes from above and behind, a position you don't see until his rounds are already finding Peter's aircraft, and you watch close enough to see clearly, too far to do anything except watch, as the smoke trailing from Peter's engine becomes something else entirely, a sudden violent brightness that the distance does nothing to soften. You do not see a parachute. You fire at the 109 responsible, with a focus that has nothing remaining of training's careful detachment. And you don't know, in the moment, whether you hit him, because you are not tracking the engagement anymore so much as existing inside a single continuous reflex that has temporarily replaced every other function of your mind. And when the German aircraft does break away, smoking, diving, you do not feel triumph or even relief. You feel only the specific absence where Peter's habit of humming before takeoff used to be. You land at 1,455. Your fuel gauge shows 4 minutes of remaining flight time, which is closer to the edge of the aircraft's range than any flight you've made before. A fact you register without particular alarm, because alarm requires a capacity you don't currently have available. The squadron leader's clipboard, when you check it in the debriefing room, has Peter's name already marked. The specific, bureaucratic speed of a system that has learned not to wait for confirmation before beginning the paperwork that confirmation eventually requires. You sit in a chair that someone has placed for you without your noticing, and you do not cry, because crying is a thing you will eventually do, later, in private, but not now. Not in a room with 8 other pilots who are all managing their own versions of exactly this. Your logbook entry for the 18th of August will eventually read 3 sorties, 1 confirmed kill, 1 probable. It will not mention Peter's name. It will not mention the humming. The official record of the hardest day in the history of RAF Fighter Command does not have a column for the specific things that actually happened inside it. The Battle of Britain did not end on a single date that anyone experienced as an ending while it was happening. It thinned out, gradually, through September and into October, the daylight raids becoming less frequent as the Luftwaffe's daytime losses accumulated past what their own mathematics could sustain. The threat shifting toward the night bombing that would define the Blitz through that autumn and winter, a different war fought by different aircraft and, largely, different men. You flew through all of it. You did not know, on any given day in September, that you were living through what history would eventually agree to call the climax of the battle, because history's agreements are retrospective and the actual days simply continued arriving, one after another, each with its own mathematics of fuel and ammunition and the specific exhaustion that had become, by then, less a temporary condition than a permanent feature of being 20 years old and alive in 1940. You finished the battle by whatever date historians eventually settled on for its conclusion, with 7 confirmed kills, 3 probables, and a logbook that documented everything except the things that actually mattered, which was, you came to understand, simply what logbooks were, for a record of the war's bureaucratic shape, rather than its human one. Peter Hadley's parents wrote to you in October. You had written to them first, a letter you spent 4 evenings drafting and redrafting, trying to find language for the specific quality of a man you'd known for 8 weeks, and would have known. You were certain, for the rest of both your lives, under any other circumstances. They wrote back with a grace that humbled you, thanking you for the letter, asking small questions about their son's daily life, that you answered as completely as you could. Yes, he hummed before takeoff. Yes, he was good at this. Yes, everyone liked him. Yes, he was brave in the specific, quiet way that doesn't announce itself. You did not tell them you had watched. Some information, you had decided, belonged only to you, a private ledger of the war's actual cost that official records would never need to balance. You kept his last letter to you, unopened, for 3 weeks before you could bring yourself to read it. A letter Peter had given you to post for him the morning of the 18th, addressed to a girl in Surrey he'd mentioned only once, in passing, with the specific carelessness of someone who assumed there would be time later to mention her properly. You posted it unread, as he'd asked. You never learned her name. You have wondered, across every year since, whether she ever understood what she was to a boy who hummed before takeoff and never came home to tell her so himself. The squadron held a small service in late September, the kind that fighter squadrons held when the operational tempo allowed exactly enough pause for grief and no more a few words, a few drinks. A return to readiness by morning, because the sky did not wait for morning to finish before sending the next formation across the coast. You stood at the back. You did not speak. You thought about the humming and the 4 seconds and the specific arithmetic of where a man happens to be looking during the precise moment that decides everything. You were 20 years old that August. You were not particularly brave. By your own assessment, you simply did, each day, the next necessary thing, 4 seconds at a time, for as long as the sky required it of you. Peter did not get to find out what the rest of his 4 seconds would have added up to. You carried that difference for the rest of your life, the way you carried everything else from that summer, quietly, completely, without a column in any logbook built to hold it. That was enough. That was always enough.